Where Eagles Fly, Uncensored, by R.S. Hunter. A true story as told by John A. Campbell III, known as Red. Where Eagles Fly, Uncensored, copyright 2012 by R.S. Hunter, edited by J. Hamlin. Based on Where Eagles Fly, Remember Me, copyright R.S. Hunter 2008, edited by Paula Starker. References from John A. Campbell III. All rights reserved. No part of this publication may be reproduced in any form or by any electronic or mechanical means, including information storage and retrieval systems, without the prior written permission of the copyright owners. Exceptions are made for brief excerpts used in published reviews. All of the situations or events depicted, as well as names and places, are true. The details within the story are based on the actual events as per the memory of John Campbell III. Publisher, Amethyst Moon, Tucson, Arizona. Library of Congress Control Number 201291638. This novel is dedicated to the memory of Red and all he sacrificed for the freedom of the world during World War II. To his daughter, Carrie, my wife. To all of the descendants, including those not yet born, who need to hear Red's story. I offer sincere thanks to my editor, J. Hamlin, for his time, work, and dedication in helping me to complete this book. Forward. It is amazing when we look back at our lives to review the paths we have trodden, sometimes with shame and other times with honor and pride. This is the story of such a path, the path that led a young boy of dreams hurtling towards his destiny. This was a destiny that would overflow with excitement, adventure, fear, and pain, and dance upon the edge of torture, hopelessness, and demise. Yet while he fed his ravenous hunger for adventure, a military action taking place thousands of miles away would alter his life's path forever and change the destiny that lay before him. After his long, slow dance with his nemesis, he found himself liberated from the jaws of death, living within the real world, where people loved and where babies cried and where all seemed to be harmonious. His scars would become his nightmares that would eventually become distant memories, memories that were his scars. This was his vicious cycle. It is understandable why he made the decisions he did. They started out as simple, boyish fantasies that grew into a love for the thrill of traveling faster than any grounded machine he had known. He saw himself soaring faster and higher, yet it was only a dream. How would this impoverished child ever see his dreams come true? What would he have to sacrifice before he was able to taste the freedom he so longed? And would he be able to afford the price? Was it worth it? He would put it all on the line, including his own life, so that he could soar where eagles fly. Chapter 1. John Jr. Arrives. The year was 1921, and President Warren G. Harding was making himself at home at the White House. The country was at peace, and the Roaring Twenties were gearing up. It was just another normal day in the Campbell household. Dad was away, which was normal for a Navy family during these lean years. Mom was a stay-at-home mom whose primary responsibility was taking care of their children. She was previously married to a man who fathered her son Jack and daughter Liz, but unfortunately he was killed in a freak truck accident, leaving her to raise the children by herself, as if times weren't hard enough. While John Campbell II was based at a naval station in New Jersey, the two of them met and sparks began to fly. After a brief courtship, it was obvious their souls were destined to intertwine forever. They eventually married in 1920 in Long Beach, California. Now here was Mom a year later, once again with child, very close to the end of her 9th month. The weather in Southern California was normal for November. Clouds were high in the sky, showing off their majestic grandeur, yet the temperature was rather mild. There was a slight cool breeze working its way from the ocean through an opened window in the kitchen. It seemed like just another perfect day in paradise. Events were about to take place that would change things forever for everybody in the Campbell household. A new adventure was about to begin. It was November 3rd, 1921, a normal Thursday. Mom was so tired and still busy doing chores that needed to be done, cleaning, cooking, and watching the kids. Then, without notice, she felt a sharp pain, a pain she had known before. As she looked down, she saw herself standing in a puddle. Fluids were still flowing down her legs. This was the moment, a new beginning. This was the birth of a path that started right here in this small home in San Pedro, California. This was the moment John Jr. would come into this world and make his presence known. It was no longer going to be the house that everyone knew. There was now another Campbell, another John Campbell. He was John Campbell III. They called him Jr. The delivery went well with the aid of the local doctor who had been summoned to manage the home delivery. 10 fingers and 10 toes, a red-headed surprise for John Sr. was wrapped up like a bundle upon his return. Liz was now a big sister to Junior, and Jack now had a new baby brother to play ball with. Jack was pleased with the whole new brother thing, but Liz wasn't so sure what to think of her world being rocked upside down. She would be challenged by John for years to come. Liz always said when the doctor came that day to deliver John, he arrived with a black bag and left the baby behind. This was her way of dealing with her new rival, baby John. She wasn't very impressed by the doctor or the events of the day. Mom, with a new baby in the house, had way too many chores and not enough time to complete them. Everyone was going to have to pitch in and help. Dad was too busy with his naval career to get involved with household duties, so his job would be bringing home the bacon. Mom gave the cooking responsibility to Liz, who evolved into one of the worst cooks known to man. Mom obviously didn't spend a whole lot of time on training her daughter the secrets of good cooking. Jack would have to handle all of the outside tasks such as mowing the lawn, chopping wood, and anything else that would save Mom time and energy. Junior was a skinny baby, a trait that would stay with him through his entire childhood, all the way into his early years as an adult. Not to say Junior didn't love to eat. He enjoyed what he thought to be great food, not realizing the food he was fed, prepared by Liz, was not only bland and without taste, but probably not the most nutritional food to be given a young, growing boy. It wasn't until he got older and started sampling food prepared by anyone other than Liz that he realized there was much more to a great meal than just volume and texture. Food could actually taste good. Really good. Being a Navy household, there was always constant relocating as Dad received new orders every 3 to 4 years. San Pedro, California was no exception. When Junior was only a year old, Dad was posted to Panama. The entire family was packed up onto a ship and headed south. This would be their home for the next 3 years. Junior didn't have a lot of memories from this time, but he heard all of the stories from his family about their Central American experience. He heard about the time when Lily, his younger sister, who was born in Panama, in the spring of 1923, fell on her head and fractured her skull in 3 places. But none of this really mattered to John, as he was focused on things that preschool boys focused on: chasing bugs, breaking toys, and getting outside to play with friends, and all of the other magical wonders of the world was where he focused his attentions and concerns. As he reached the age of 4.5 years, he was back in Southern California with the Campbell clan. They settled into a home in Ocean Beach, California, and remained there for 1 year until a local move to Lincoln Acres, California was arranged. All of these moves were the result of the Navy. There were no questions to be asked, just pack your things, again, and hit the road. So moving only 20 miles away seemed unusually out of place. But this was not Junior's concern. He was just following along without a care in the world. What else could a preschooler do? His first truly exciting memory was during the move from Ocean Beach, or OB, to Lincoln Acres. Junior was given permission to sit on the back of the moving truck, dangling his legs over the edge as the moving van navigated its way through traffic. To a 6-year-old boy, this was an amazing adventure that awed him to no end. This was probably his first taste of adrenaline, and he liked it. He liked it a lot. In Lincoln Acres, Junior would start his school career at the Paradise Hills Grammar School. He seemed to fit right in with his peers, and like every other 6-year-old boy, he would come home with the occasional scraped knees or scabbed elbows. Junior and Jack were still the low boys on the totem pole when it came to the women in the household. On more than one occasion he would find himself in trouble for no explainable reason. Lily would just wait until no one was looking, then start yelling, "Mom, he's hitting me," only to have Junior disciplined by being forced to sit in the kitchen on a stool where Mom can keep an eye on him. "But Mom, I didn't touch her," he would protest, to no avail. It was stool solitaire for Junior until his eventual parole hours later. When these entrapments were successful, Junior, while sitting there upon the stool and itching to get back outside where his youthful adventures were awaiting, he would remind himself of the stories he heard about Lily's fall on her head in Panama. This would bring a smile to his face. He always referred to her spoiled temper tantrums as convulsions of convenience. It always amazed him how she would have a convulsion whenever things didn't go her way. When she became of dating age, her convulsions just seemed to vanish. One day, Mom and Dad finally caught on to Lily's dramatic exaggerations and decided to give her a good old-fashioned spanking. "Well, just allow me to give you something to scream about," Dad would say as he zeroed in on his target. The spanking actually brought a sort of pleasurable sensation over Junior. Just rewards, and Lily's were due. In Lincoln Acres there was a grassy knoll where John liked to escape, just to get away from his female-dominated household. Dad had the Navy, and Junior had this grassy field. I guess you can call it Junior's Field of Dreams. He would lie there for hours, and Junior was astonished at how easily the birds flew and how effortlessly they soared up high in the sky. With barely a wing movement, they were able to glide and turn as if driven by the wind. He thought how amazing it would be to experience that same sort of freedom. He yearned to be driven by the wind like the hot air balloons he saw in comic books, or like the mighty bald eagle, the symbol of this great country, or like the biplanes that broke the silence of his solitude. It was the biplanes that astonished him the most. Where are these planes coming from? Where are they going? What makes them fly? What does the world look like from way up there? What does the wind feel like rushing across one's face? These were just a few of the dozens of questions that flooded every part of his consciousness. These were the questions that sparked the gradual evolution of Junior's dreams. Once the dreams were set in and embedded into his core, it wasn't too long before his dreams started evolving into exciting realities. Once upon that path, there would be no turning back. Junior didn't care. All he knew was that there was a passion boiling up inside, and he couldn't control it. He didn't want to control it. This would be the start of his journey towards his own hell. This path would hurtle him towards unimaginable challenges. The odds would be stacked up against him, but Junior loved the challenge. Chapter 2. He Had a Dream. When Junior reached the age of 7, his father was posted to Hawaii. This was where Junior would spend the next 3 years of his young, influential life. This was where his name would evolve from Junior to Red. He hated the name Junior. He was often teased by his schoolmates whenever they heard his sisters call him, "Junior, time to come home," or "Junior, dinner's ready." His sisters would shout, "Junior, Junior, Junior," his friends would tease. So when they started calling him Red because of his hair color, Junior was relieved to turn in his junior ID for a more user-friendly Red call sign. There was another thing about the Hawaii experience that Red really enjoyed. During his entire stay on the island, he probably wore shoes only a handful of times. After all, none of the local kids wore shoes, so why should he? Some of Red's fondest memories of his childhood emerged from the Hawaiian experiences. This was a magical place, a place that seemed like a perfect environment to raise a young boy, a place that would remain in Red's heart for the rest of his days. It was at a local carnival on the Big Island where he got to take his first plane ride. They charged a penny a pound, and being a skinny 75 pounds, he was on board for only 75 cents. This would irritate his sister, who weighed considerably more. For the next 15 or 20 minutes, nothing else in the world seemed to exist. Young Red was airborne. He was one with the clouds. He was the eagle. He was remembering back to his field of dreams, that grassy knoll where the biplanes performed just for him. Red now knew what it was like to look down from the great heights, or to feel the wind lapping upon his face, to soar where eagles fly. A spark in the deepest recesses of his soul was ignited and would remain lit forever, growing stronger as each day, month, and year passed. The thrill of flying was even better than dangling your legs off of the back of a moving van. There was no comparison to anything he had experienced before, and he wanted more. The flying bug had bitten him, and the wound would never heal. After his dad completed his Hawaiian tour, it was back to San Diego for the Campbells. They moved into National City, California, just south of San Diego, where the Navy had its shipyard. Convenient location for Dad, and without knowing it at the time, it would be an extremely convenient location for Red as well. Moving to National City brought Red closer to his dream than he ever expected to be. It was now just around the corner. It was like those puffy clouds in his field of dreams. All he had to do was reach out and grab on. And once he grabbed on, it was up to him to hold on tightly, because this was going to be a long, bumpy trip into Red's fate. As a young lad just entering junior high school, Red was finding himself preoccupied, but not in the sense of his peers whose preoccupation was waking up each morning thinking about the girls at school and how to hone their skills of attracting the opposite sex. Much like the majestic peacock who dances around with feathers spanning as wide as they can, these boys had their own feathers, slicked back hair, hanging with the right crowd, and most of all, attitude. Red, the teenager, was fanning his feathers in a totally different direction. The Matson Flying Service was located between Chula Vista and National City. It was only 5 miles from his house. This was what caused the spark in Red's eyes. This was his focus. This was where he felt he needed to be. It didn't matter if his hair was slicked back or who he hung around with. None of that mattered here. The one personality trait that would serve him the best would be his attitude, and this kid had plenty of it. There were a couple of boys from his school who also hung around with him to watch the planes take off and land. They were known as the Savino brothers. Virgil was a couple of years younger than Red and actually worked at the Matson Flying Service for money and flying lessons. It was Virgil who introduced Red to this facility and to the potential of exchanging time behind a broom for time behind a joystick. The other brother was named Frank. Frank was Red's best friend. They did everything together. These 3 boys would daydream and with excitement exchange stories they either heard or read about. There were flying magazines that sold for 2 bits on every newsstand. In these magazines were fantastic stories of fighter pilots from World War I. The Red Baron was an imaginary target for all 3 of these boys on many occasions, when make-believe missions were being flown. Red Campbell shot down the Red Baron on more than one occasion, as did his buddies. Was it a coincidence that Red and the Red Baron shared the same first name? As time passed and Red's heart grew stronger for the passion of becoming a pilot, he demonstrated to the operators of the Madsen Flying Service that he would be an asset to them if they would only give him a chance. "Well, how much do you think you're worth?" they asked him in jest. Red's reply sealed the deal, sealed his destiny, sealed his fate. His reply was simply, "Nothing, not a penny. All I ask for is flying lessons. I will clean hangars, wash planes, help with oil changes and other routine maintenance jobs, and simply ask for cockpit time." It was the devotion and desire that sparkled in his eyes that convinced management that this was a win-win situation. "Done. You've got a deal," his new employers replied. Red was overjoyed. After shaking hands to confirm the contract, he was immediately given a broom and told to start sweeping. It is amazing how big a hangar really is when you're standing in the middle of it, looking up with a tiny whisk broom in your hand. Every spare minute of every day he spent at Madison learning from the pros. To his mentors, these tasks were mundane, but to Red they were absorbed as fascinating jobs that slightly quenched his thirst for more knowledge, avionic knowledge, that is. The more they gave him, the more he absorbed. The more he absorbed, the more he proved himself as a responsible aeronautical mechanic. And best of all, he proved he could fly. It was almost like he had an instinct for it, an instinct that, for those who possessed it, would find themselves with wheels touching down safely. Others, without it, would simply perish. Red's first lesson was probably his most memorable. Bill Gibbs was one of the associates at Madison. Bill had a hangar where he kept his 2 airplanes. Up until now, the hangar had a dirt floor, and it was Bill's intention to lay brick down so it would be easier to move the planes around and make a cleaner working environment. Bill needed help, and young Red was up for the challenge. It took 2 or 3 weekends, but eventually the job was done, and now it was payday. Red had earned himself 30 minutes of flying lesson time. The first lesson was in an American Eagle with a Curtiss OX-5 engine. As soon as the aircraft was airborne, Red got to play with the stick to see exactly what it can do. Pull it this way and push it like that, and he was instructed. He did what he was told. After practicing a couple of turns, it was time to have a go at landing. He was shown the mechanics of gauging the approach, and when the wheels touched down for the first time, Bill pulled back on the stick, causing them to climb once again so another landing approach could be practiced. It was the day Red had waited so long for. His spark was now aflame, and there was plenty of fuel in his soul to feed the fire. He was awed at the fact that the airplane's controls were so sensitive to the touch. His touch. Young Red was now a flyer, just like the Eagle. Just starting the plane was more fun than he ever imagined. The checklist was simple. There wasn't one. Switch off was confirmed. Pulling the prop 2 or 3 times would charge the cylinders. Switch on was then confirmed as the prop was pulled once again to start the engine. After a short warm-up, the pilot would run the RPM and check the 2 magnetos. Once all seemed okay, it was time to line up with the runway and make sure that there were no horses grazing in the way. Grazing horses and airplanes don't play well together. This was Red's favorite part, taking off and feeling the raw power beneath him. He was taught how to open the throttle and hold the stick forward until the tail started coming up. Once adequate speed was obtained, it was time to pull back on the stick into a neutral position. Pulling back the stick a little more would cause the wheels and ground to separate. It was time to play where eagles fly. Landing was a little more challenging. Like taking off, you had to land into the wind. After you turned to the base leg and then turned to final approach, it was time to touch down. Red learned all of these steps as easily as he learned to walk. It was just came naturally to him. It was because he had that special gift. That instinct would become his guardian angel. It would never allow anything bad to happen to him. He longed to be in the cockpit like a mother longs to cuddle her child. Red's child was his passion. His children were many. Their names were American Eagle, California Cub, Tommy Morris Scout, and of course, Piper Cub. It was the Piper Cub that Red did his first solo flight, Red's favorite child, although he loved them all. By the time Red graduated high school in June of 1940 at the ripe old age of 18, he had logged in over 220 hours of flying time. Not to mention he was also on staff with Madsen as a mechanic and pilot. It seemed like everything was going his way. He had reached those clouds and still refused to let go. His dream had come true. With 220 hours of flying time under his belt, he actually logged in more flying time than pilots 2 or 3 times his age. And the best of all, he had that instinct, an instinct that you can't get from book learning or listening to someone else telling you how it should be done. This was a gut instinct that was deep-rooted within his soul, and it wasn't going anywhere. So here it is, the summer of 1940, and Red was a young man with an air of accomplishment about him. His thick red hair stood out like the summer sunset as he sauntered down the street. Girls were interested, very interested. He had all the right feathers being displayed just like that old peacock. But his interest was still Curtiss engines, torque, airspeed, and all of these other things that made machines fly. Now, he still enjoyed the occasional evening with girls, maybe attending a dance or going out for a soda. Going roller skating was also a favorite pastime where one can impress a young lady. But flying was at the pinnacle of his being. Everything else just had to settle for second or maybe even third place. On the global scene, Poland was invaded by Germany. Europe had been fighting now for almost a year, and it just seemed to be getting worse. The United States had been able to stay out of it, but for how long? Britain seemed to be the only country that had the backbone to stand up and fend off the German menace. But they couldn't do it alone. They needed help, American help. The world had become a very dark and ugly place. Chapter 3. The Funny Little Man with the Mustache. September 1939. War breaks out in Europe. These were the global headlines, so by the time Red had finished high school in 1940, he, like every other young man in America, felt like it was an opportunity to step up to the plate and to do their part. This was even better than those comics or magazines he liked to read glorifying the ace fighter pilots of World War I. He was itching to fight. He was itching to kill Nazis. Red liked to believe that this funny little man with that little mustache started the war just for his benefit. It was enticing. The obvious choice was to go down to the local United States Air Force Recruitment Center and sign up as a fighter pilot. It was extremely disappointing when he found out he didn't meet the minimum eligibility requirements. In order to join this elite group of flyers, you had to have at least 2 years of higher education. You also needed to be at least 21 years of age in order to receive a commission. Being too young and too stupid, and maybe a little hard-headed as well, Red said no thanks and went on with Plan B. Now, if Red could only figure out what Plan B was, he'd be set. While working at Madsen, you couldn't help but hear all of the stories about great American flyers in the RAF, the Royal Air Force. There was Billy Fisk, who was the first American to die as an RAF pilot during the Battle of Britain. Then there was Art Donahue, who was shot down during the Battle of Britain and ended up being badly burnt. After an extensive recovery period, Art was sent home to Minnesota, where he was honored as a hero. Art wrote some very interesting articles, including one entitled Yank in a Spitfire. These stories, along with all of the other ace pilot publications, fueled young Red's fire, which was now burning hotter than ever before. There were 3 Canadian brothers who visited Madsen on many occasions. Gene, Richard, and Jack were flyers, and Red always found conversation with them entertaining. One day, as the 3 brothers were leaving the airfield, Gene turned to Red and said, "See you later, Red. We're off to shoot down Nazis." Red wanted in. This was going to be his plan B. He desperately needed to know more. Red had been trying to enlist for months. Chasing the trio as they tried to leave, Red interrogated them for more details. They gladly shared their plan. Now Red had a name and address. A guy named Windall in Glendale, just outside of Los Angeles. Not that far up the road, he thought. It was well worth the trip. Red always admired Jack, Richard, and Jean. They always had something interesting or funny to share. The brothers recognized the spark in Red's eye and were willing to help him in any way possible. The Canadian brothers believed in this young eagle who desperately wanted to spread his wings. Jack ended up being killed in a C-47 transport while flying into some really bad weather, right into the side of a mountain. Nobody on board saw it coming. The crash site went undiscovered for almost 40 years. Richard served with the Royal Canadian Air Force until he transferred to the USAF after Pearl Harbor. When the war was over, he retired as a full colonel. Then there was Jean. Poor Jean. There was only 2 times Red was airsick, and Jean was the cause of one of them. Red was sitting behind Jean once during a flight. Jean started to get airsick and turned around to let it go. And let it go he did, right into Red's face. They both landed looking greener than they were during takeoff. Jean had a big problem with air sickness. He got busted out of pilot training due to his motion sickness issues. Then he got busted out of navigational training for the same reasons. Being desperate to fly, he signed on as an air gunner while transferring to the U.S. Army Air Force. He finished his training successfully by using airsick bags. Many airsick bags. It was just like Jean's luck during his first mission over Germany. His plane was shot down. Jean spent the rest of the war as a POW. At least he survived. After the war, he spent the rest of his days living in Northern California. So it was up to LA for Red to meet this Wendell guy. Apparently he was an American who served with the RAF during World War I. He was also a member of the Clayton Smith Night Committee. This was a committee established by Billy Bishop, Homer Smith, and Clayton Knight, eventually known in Canada as the Canadian Aviation Bureau. This group helped place 8,200 Americans into the Royal Canadian Air Force and the Royal Air Force during a period of U.S. neutrality prior to the United States declaring war on Germany and Japan. The seeds of the Clayton Knight Committee were planted as Hitler imposed his expansionist policy upon Europe. The only way to stop him was to create a British Commonwealth United Air Force. Wendell was an interesting person, Red thought. His small and cramped office was located in his garage. Just have a seat and wait, he was instructed by Wendell. Within 10 minutes or so, Wendell entered, sat down behind his desk, and asked Red for his documentation. After reviewing Red's pilot logbook, Wendell had his doubts. He thought that this kid was too young and couldn't possibly have as many hours as were noted. Wendell questioned the logbook's authenticity as well as Red's age and motivation. Red, not being one to take defeat so easily, asked, "Well, if I come back when I'm 19, will you take me then?" After all, the logbook was notarized, so the only real objection Wendell could possibly have was his age. "Well, if you come back when you're 19 with a note from your parents, well, we'll talk about it then," Wendell replied. That was all Red needed to hear. Since it was already October 1940, Red only had a month to wait until his 19th birthday. That's plenty of time to get back home, have a note written, and to get the rest of his things in order. He knew there would be no more delays, or at least he hoped. Young Red took his time preparing for his return trip to Los Angeles. With his bag packed and slung over his shoulder, he made his rounds, giving goodbyes to all of his friends at Madison. Hugs and kisses to the family came next. All was in order, and most importantly, he had his note. It basically said that John Jr. had their approval to undergo additional training. In other words, his folks may have had their own doubts about Red's dream. Well, against their wishes, those dreams were now quickly forming into their son's realities. Realities that can kill. Wendell, somewhat surprised to see Red again, remembered his offer, and due to the dire need in the Commonwealth for able-bodied pilots, he read the note and with a smile gave Red his official stamp of approval. Red was immediately sent to the Hollywood Roosevelt Hotel, where he was to meet another guy named Benway. Now Benway looked and acted like a bigwig. Red was impressed. After a short interview, Red was told to report to Cal Aero, located at the Grand Central Airport near Glendale, California. Red reported there on December 8, 1940. He was exactly 19 years, 1 month, and 5 days old. But who's counting? The school at the airport was called Polaris, a subsidiary of the Curtiss Wright Technical Institute. Major Mosley was in command, and he immediately let everybody know he was the boss. He ran everything. He was Curtiss Wright Technical Institute. Nobody questioned his authority. This is where young Red was put through some basic schooling. There was flight school, ground school, instrument training, and aero basic and formation flight training as well. Polaris was going to be his home for a while. This was more than he ever dreamed. Like the flying lessons he received at Madison, Red absorbed everything they threw at him with a hunger for more. What made this event even more amazing was the fact that he didn't have to sweep out hangars or do other tedious chores in trade for cockpit time. All he had to do was pay attention and learn. And they actually paid him to do this. Great food, too. He received the same pay as the cadets on base. It was a salary of $125 per month, minus $75 for room and board. This left him with a healthy $50 a month to spend on anything he wanted. Girls. Hiram Simpkins, a cousin of Red's, lived in the Glendale area. One day he invited Red to go out on a blind date. Hiram knew this girl from school and thought that Red would like to meet her and that they would get along nicely together. Sure, why not? Red agreed. Hiram and Red stopped by her house to pick her up. Red waited in the car, eagerly anticipating what was about to be. As Hiram held the door open for her, she let herself into the car. Red was pleased and immediately said, "Hi, I'm John Campbell III. She said, "Hi, my name is Gladys Horn," while reaching in to shake his hand. "Nice to meet you," he stammered, trying not to say anything stupid or appropriate. "They call me Red," he replied with a smile. All Red could think of as they drove off were those eyes. They were hypnotic. Every time he looked at her, he would try to form words, but his mind was overriding his thoughts with wows. Her eyes hypnotized him. All of a sudden, flying wasn't at the forefront of his thoughts. All he could think of were those eyes. They seemed to be calling him. Was she feeling the same way? Or was it just the moment? Time would tell. They headed off to a local Hollywood studio where a Bundles for Britain dance was being held. This was always a fun evening, as it gave you an opportunity to get close to your date while dancing, and it was free. Red actually knew how to dance, and this impressed Gladys. It was a good thing for Red that as a child his sisters shared him as a non-willing dance partner to practice their own moves on. He hated it when they called "Junior, dance with me." But now he was sort of grateful. He was thankful for all of those embarrassing hours being passed around like a rag doll. If only his sisters can see him now. The next time he asked Gladys for a date was New Year's weekend, January 1941. She said no. She told him that she had a babysitting obligation and couldn't get out of it. Years later he found out that she said no because she thought he was moving a little too fast for her, and so she wanted to slow him down a bit. Her saying no did slow him down, but it didn't stop him from trying. During that New Year's weekend, because he now had nothing to do, he decided to get together with his cousin Hiram and his buddy Paul. He knew Paul from Madsen. They headed into town for a few beers. While walking along the sidewalk, they met a chap who stopped and chatted with them for 10 minutes or so before heading on his way down the street. Nice fellow, they all agreed. About 15 minutes later, they heard a noise coming from an alley, and when they turned to see what was going on, they saw their newfound friend being beat up by a bunch of Mexicans in zoot suits. It wasn't a fair fight, 4 against 1. "I don't think so," Red shouted as he headed into battle. Paul followed quietly behind. Hiram decided to stay out of it. A decision that would irritate Red for years to come. Coward. One of the zoot suits had this poor chap up against the wall and was punching him in the head over and over again. Red grabbed the zoot by the shoulder and spun him around, landing a solid hit. Paul was busy with his own suit. 2 of the Mexicans ran away, leaving only 2 to defend themselves against Red and Paul. The other chap was in no condition to help. They didn't care. They could handle this. Then, just as Red was about to deliver his knockout punch, he got cold-cocked into the back of the head by a set of brass knuckles. Little birdies and pretty stars started dancing around in his head as he went down on one knee. Just as the zoot delivered the knockout blow to Red, Paul slammed him with all he had. The fight was over for that zoot suit. Apparently the Mexican had his mouth partially open, so when he received Paul's thump, his mouth slammed closed, severely slicing his tongue. It was at that point that the police arrived and took everybody down to the station for processing. If only Gladys wasn't busy that night, none of this would have happened. But then again, if Red and Paul weren't there to help, this chap might have been killed. Was it fate? The cops realized Red and Paul were heroes and immediately had the police medical attendant tend to their wounds. When the boys were finally sewn up, they watched as the attendant asked one of the zoots, the one with the forked tongue, to open his mouth so that an assessment could be done. As soon as his mouth was open, a swabbling splash of iodine was thrust in and physically swished around, causing the Mexican so much pain he almost passed out. Red and Paul got a kick out of watching. They enjoyed the payback. So did the police, it seemed. After seeing where the 2 zoots were going to spend the night in smelly jail cell hell, and not wanting to jeopardize their deployment overseas, they decided not to press charges. The police drove the 2 heroes back to where they were when they picked them up and wished them luck in killing the bad guys overseas. As they exited the police cruiser, Red noticed Hiram was still standing where they had left him an hour earlier. Red never forgave him. Hiram never mentioned that night again. Red never forgot. It was only a month later when Red would attend the funeral of his friend Paul. Paul was the only student killed during training, and Red felt the pain. Lots of pain. Not because of the accident, but because of the reason for the accident. It could have been avoided. Paul was somewhat of a cowboy when it came to flying. He liked to push the envelope whenever he could, and one day he just pushed that envelope a little too far, and he paid the ultimate price, his life. Paul was flying in a prototype aircraft called a Tim. There were 2 seats in this plane, and when one flew solo, it was common to place a sandbag on the back seat and strap it in so that the plane's weight would be balanced. Paul was doing a flyby at one of the movie studios where he had some friends watching, and he suddenly decided to show off by going into a half roll. During the roll, the sandbag came loose and hit the instrument panel. The plane's nose dove right into the ground. Stupid, stupid, stupid. This was Red's third death by crash where he had known the deceased. There was a famous baseball player named Ted Williams who lived in the San Diego area. He went by many nicknames including The Kid, Splendid Splinter, Teddy Ballgame, and The Thumper. Ted's cousin was named Austin, and Austin regularly flew out of Madsen. Red got to know him very well due to the fact that Austin was good friends with Virgil and Frank Savino. Austin perished in a low-flying accident. Pilot error. Stupid, stupid, stupid. Then there was Malik, who decided to take 2 nurses for a joyride out of Madsen. Red knew he wasn't the greatest pilot around, but he could fly a plane and bring it back safely and land it in one piece. Malik definitely didn't have that special instinct Red came to depend on. As Malik was boarding his plane with the 2 nurses, Red offered to help the girls board and get strapped in. When the last one was secure, he wished them a great flight and stood back to watch the trio taxi into a takeoff position. Within moments, they were airborne. For some unknown reason, Malik tried to do crazy maneuvers showing off his flying skills. He lost control and slammed into the ground, hard and fast. Red ran to the crash site driven by adrenaline. Red was running full speed into the horror scene he would never forget. Upon his arrival, he saw one of the nurses had been thrown from the plane and was lying on the ground, her body badly broken, limbs bent in unnatural ways, dead. Malik was strapped into the pilot seat with compound fractures on both legs. His face was unrecognizable, smashed in by the instrument panel. Dead. The other nurse was still in her seat, barely alive, grasping for air. Red helped her out of the wreckage and onto the ground, where he cuddled her in his arms. She died within minutes. Stupid, stupid, stupid. This was never going to happen to him. He knew the rules. He knew what he could do and what he couldn't do. He knew the limitations of his plane. He had that gut instinct. And he would always be safe. He had to believe in that in order to keep his skills sharp and on point. So now that Paul was gone, Red continued to see Gladys on weekends. This helped him deal with his recent loss, and she was sympathetic to his needs. Since she was still in high school, weekends were really the only time they would have to spend together. Quiet picnics in the park, as well as long, peaceful walks, became their favorite pastime. This was the time they would get to know each other. This was their time. And even the thoughts of planes and classes and Paul seemed to fade away whenever they were together. These were the sort of healthy distractions young Red needed. But as soon as he dropped her off at home, everything bounced back into perspective. He was a pilot again. It was all about flying. Although Gladys did have the ability to slip back into his thoughts every now and then when he least expected it. And it was good. He felt that he had found a soulmate. She was someone who understood who he was. He cherished her. Red knew Gladys was special, and it had to be those eyes, those amazing eyes. Was she stealing part of his soul? Could he afford the distraction? Was she his fate, or was she his destiny?
It was the first week of March, 1941, when Red finally completed his training. He was about to board a train for Ottawa, Canada's capital in the province of Ontario. Red was too excited to worry about traveling so far from his family. He didn't even think about his friends at Madison or Southern California. His adventure was moving on to the next stage. But there was Gladys popping into his thoughts. He was going to miss her. He would miss her a lot. So he went out and he spent a month's salary on a wristwatch. A full $50. But it didn't matter to Red. He didn't care. Gladys was worth it, and if he had more to spend, he would have. This irritated her father, as he wanted to buy her a watch for graduation, but Red beat him to it. Her dad ended up buying her an opal ring instead, so it all worked out in the long run for Gladys. As he handed her his gift, he asked, "Will you wait for me?" She looked deeply into his eyes and replied with a loving, "Maybe." He had to laugh at her bluntness. But she was right. After all, they had just met, and a lot could happen down the road. So they both agreed to adopt a wait-and-see outlook for their future together. Gladys ended up joining the Waves and doing her part for the war effort, as did many thousands of women during these trying times. And yes, she dated other guys just to keep her options open. There was Red, along with 5 other guys who graduated from training. They found themselves on a train heading north towards the Canadian border. They were joined by 4 flyers from Tulsa who had also completed similar training in Oklahoma. All 10 of them were heading to the RAF through Canada. Bill Geiger, who was trained with Red's group, achieved the lowest training scores. So when they arrived in Ottawa, it was only Bill who had to qualify. Once he passed, all 6 were immediately passed. They stayed at the Fairmont Chateau Laurier Hotel, which to these boys was the ultimate in luxury. Everything was provided for them, and the service was first class. They were treated like movie stars. When the pubs in Ottawa closed, it was easy to cross the river into Hull, Quebec, where the bars remained open for many more hours. How convenient. They were still wearing their California clothes, so they found the weather a little cold, but nobody seemed to worry about it. They were sure this would be rectified shortly. But there was still snow on the ground, and the weather was getting down to almost 32 degrees at night. The boys decided a shot of Canadian whiskey would take the chill off. While in Ottawa, Red met a lot of guys who were in the RCAF, the Royal Canadian Air Force. Melhur was one of them. He stayed in Canada as a flight instructor and let it be known that the RCAF was willing to offer any of the boys a Royal Canadian Air Force First Lieutenant commission, along with a salary of $245 per month if they remained in Canada as flight instructors. Great offer, but the problem with it was flight instructors in the RCAF never saw action. They stayed in Canada. How can you kill Nazis from the Uplands Air Base in Ottawa? Thanks, but no thanks. March 20th, 1941, the group was on yet another train, this one heading for Halifax, Nova Scotia. This is where they were going to board their ship for England. They could almost taste it, but not yet. They still had a 2-day train ride ahead of them, and who knows what obstacles Halifax had in store for them. It was time to rest and reflect, time to socialize, time for another shot of Canadian whiskey for the chill. Arriving in Halifax was sort of a shocking experience. Up until now, everything was first class. They were used to sleeping in amazing beds with clean linens and fine dining offered on a regular basis. With the marine spring thaw taking place, the soot from the steam engines on the ships in the harbor coated everything with a black, dusty hue that just looked, smelt, and felt extremely dirty. You can actually taste the soot as you took in each breath.
They headed straight for their ship, a Belgian freighter called the Jean Jadot, which was also covered in soot. The fantail was loaded with barrels of garbage. There was nowhere to dump it. This added to the already ripe taste in the air. It wouldn't be until they pulled out to sea that they would be able to dump the trash. But not too far out to sea. The last thing they wanted to do was to have a German U-boat pick up their trail. This was a memorable day for all of the American flyers. Their commissions were backdated to the date they stepped foot upon the Jean Jadot. Pilot Officer John Campbell, that kid who lay upon that field of dreams watching biplanes soar with the Eagles, was now an officer in the Royal Air Force. Now he can look forward to what he really wanted to do: kill the bad guys. He was ready. He was eager. "Let's go. Hoist the anchor. What's the delay?" he would ask over and over again for the next couple of days. Patience wasn't his strongest trait. He was itching for the kill. He wanted to fly those big, fast, high-powered airplanes. One day, Red is in Southern California having a picnic with Gladys, and then another day he was in Ottawa being treated like royalty, and now he is stuck on this smelly, dirty hellhole of a ship, and all he could do is wait. The food on board was disgusting, even worse than that slop his sister used to make. But he had to wait. There was no other option. They couldn't leave until enough ships could be mustered together. A single ship sailing across the Atlantic was a sitting target for German U-boats. They would take down any ship if given the chance. The last thing the Germans wanted was to have ships laden with soldiers and supplies arrive in London. So convoys were the only way to go. If you had enough ships traveling together, then your chances of making it across were greater. How devastating would it be to make it this far only to find yourself sitting in a life raft, or even worse, floating face down in the North Atlantic? Bad thoughts, bad thoughts. The second day came and went, and still they found themselves moored in the dirt of Halifax. Day 3, more of the same. This was getting old now. Accepting and dealing with his frustration, Red went to bed early at the end of day 3. When he woke up the next morning, he couldn't believe his eyes. There was no land to be seen anywhere, but there were a lot of ships. They were everywhere. Big ones, little ones, and even some that seemed useless if a U-boat was encountered. There were some French battleships, one submarine, and some Canadian corvettes. Even a few dozen fishing trawlers flanked the convoy until their mid-Atlantic fishing grounds were reached. The second morning at sea, when Red got up, he noticed one of the ships in the convoy had caught fire during the night. Obviously a direct hit by a German U-boat, he imagined. Bad thoughts, bad thoughts. But those were the rumors floating around on board. All Red could do to stay sane was to focus on his goal. During the crossing, their convoy was continuously harassed by U-boats, but nothing ever happened. No other hits, no sinkings, and no people killed that they knew of. This was a boring trip, not a whole lot to do other than reflect on your mission, reflect on who and what you left behind. He missed Gladys already, and spent a lot of time thinking about her as he scanned the sea for signs of periscopes. But most of all, he thought about where his path was taking him. His destiny, which started out on that grassy knoll, was now unfolding before him. He especially thought about how he wanted to kill that funny little man with that funny little mustache, and all those who served him. That was Red's mission. This made Red smile. Chapter 4. The Eagle has landed. Out of the 18 days of being stuck within the floating city of ships, there was only one day, Easter Sunday, when the seas were actually calm. Every other day was wrought with stormy seas and bobbing horizons. For a freighter with a deep draft, the motion to and fro was manageable.
Some of the smaller vessels were getting tossed around like toys, looking as if they were going to capsize at any moment. Even the hardiest seafarer was finding himself with heads over the sides, feeding the fish. Red thought it was all very comical. He had a constitution made of iron. Rough seas to him were actually like riding rides at the county fair. Tons of fun. On that one day when the skies were blue and the seas were as calm as the placid lakes in the summertime, young Red actually got to climb up into the crow's nest. Even though it was a great experience and something different to do other than watch everybody else toss their cookies, Red thought to himself how boring being in the Navy must be. He thought of his dad. Red knew his decision to join the Flyboys was the right thing to do, and he was glad for it. Now only if he could spot land from up here, he can get off this old scow and climb back into the cockpit. There would still be a few days of rough seas to swallow before reaching the shores of Britain. Land ho! Was the rumor this cold April morning. Everybody was heading up to the bow to have a look for themselves. Young Red was already up there, in place, waiting for the sight of land to seep its way through the deep foggy marine layer. It was like heading into a wall of nothing. Everywhere you looked, there was nothing but fog, with the occasional convoy partner coming into view momentarily before disappearing again into the soup of moisture that engulfed them all. Looking down as horns were blasting, Red noticed tugboats pulling alongside and lashing themselves to the Jean Jadot. He was home. He knew it wouldn't be much longer before his arrival. Then suddenly, as if a great fan was turned on to blow the fog away, everything became clear. The wall of fog was disappearing behind them, and up front there was nothing but terra firma. This was when he knew he had arrived. He was in England, convoy HX-118, started on March 31st, 1941, and on April 18th they finally docked. The Jean Jadot with the other 32 ships made it across the frigid North Atlantic, more or less in one piece. "Farewell, Jean Jadot, thanks for the ride," Red shouted as he waved his goodbyes to the crew that he had befriended. Ironically and sadly, the Jean Jadot was torpedoed by a German U-boat on January 20th, 1943, on a convoy from Liverpool to Algiers. She was lost along with 6 of her crew. These were brave souls. The Jean Jadot served the Allies well. Hats off. Flying seemed much safer. Or was it? As far as customs or immigration went, there wasn't any. These Yanks were escorted directly to the railway station, where they boarded a train bound for London. The train actually got delayed as the Germans were trying to bomb the rail lines out of Liverpool and into London. So Red's train simply sat in the middle of nowhere waiting for the all's clear. Once they arrived in London, it was off to the Air Ministry for their final interviews before being formally accepted into the RAF. None of the Yanks realized their options were not exactly up to them. There were 2 types of pilots needed. Pilots were in demand to fly fighter aircraft as well as pilots to take the helm of bombers. It was these interviews that would determine the fate of each of the men. You could be assigned as a fighter pilot, a bomber pilot, or just as easily turned around and sent back home. This made Red a little nervous. When you fly a bomber, you are the captain of the ship. Every decision you make can affect the lives of your crew. This was a lot of responsibility, especially for a 19-year-old. It almost seemed like a little too much to handle. After all, being in a fighter, you are the crew, you are the navigator, you are the gunner or bomber, as well as the engineer and pilot. Your decisions affect you and only you. If you mess up, only you have to pay the piper. Red impressed the interviewers at the Air Ministry with his drive and determination. A fighter pilot was the only option they considered for this young, eager, somewhat strange 19-year-old. Once the interviews were complete, it was off to the Moss brothers to be measured and fitted for their dress uniforms. It was during this measuring phase Red experienced his first air raid. Here he was standing there with measuring tape and tailor doing their job, when all of a sudden sirens were going off everywhere. Red wanted to dive under the table or maybe head to the nearest air raid shelter, but his tailor simply said not to worry. This happens daily, and continued measuring away on this now very nervous young American lad. After the bombing stopped and the tailor was done with his calculations, it was off to lunch for the boys. There was so much to think about, so much to contemplate. Do I want bangers and mash, or will a ploughman's lunch do, was the conundrum Red faced. Ploughman's lunch it was, along with a pint, of course. After the lunch was consumed, they headed back to Moss Brothers, where their uniforms were ready for pickup. Red received his cap, jacket, pants, shoes, socks, undershorts, a tie, and a shirt with 2 removable collars. They fit perfectly. Back onto another train, and it was off to Sutton Bridge for their first training assignment. Now the fun begins. They were being assigned to the 56th Operational Training Unit, referred to as OTU in Sutton Bridge. Upon arrival at OTU, the first order of business was getting issued their kit. They spent the next hour sorting out their battle dress uniforms and flying gear, and basically getting settled in. Not a whole lot of time was wasted. No more sitting around waiting for ships to sail or to reach port. No more Canadian whiskey to keep you warm. No more California clothes in a frozen climate. It was now all things British. It was now all things RAF. It was now the reality of a dream coming true. The Eagle has landed. His battle dress uniform included a jumpsuit, a sweater, shirts, trousers, more socks and underwear, and an Irvine fur-lined flight jacket. The one piece of clothing that impressed him the most was his greatcoat. The felt had to be at least a 1/4 inch thick and would weather the harshest of climates. Long gone are the chilly days of wet and cold while dressed in his skimpy California attire. Long gone are the days of shivering from the dampness while trying to escape the bone-chilling wind. Long gone are the days of feeling the cold licking at his bones. From now on the weather was no longer an issue. Red was toasty. It was day 2 at OTU, and Red was instructed to report to Flight B, where he was checked out on a Miles Master aircraft. This was the British equivalent to an AT-6 advanced trainer. They just wanted to make sure Red actually knew how to manage an aircraft. This was the time to weed out those who slipped through the cracks. Luckily, nobody slipped. Everyone got the instructor's stamp of approval, as if there was any doubt about these Yanks. Being checked out was a lot of fun, Red thought. It reminded him of the good old days at Madsen, the days that now seemed so long ago in his memory. The OTU instructor at the controls of the Miles Master took off, flew once around the airfield, and did 1 landing. Then the controls were given to Red. He was instructed to proceed with 2 takeoffs and landings, while the instructor sat behind him observing. This reminded him of his flying lessons, but the stakes now were much higher. After the second landing, the instructor jumped out and told Red to do 2 solo flights. When his solo flights were complete, he spent the rest of the day sitting in a Hurricane, which was propped up on blocks. The plane was connected to auxiliary power, so Red could practice raising and lowering the wheels and flaps and anything else that could be controlled from within the cockpit. As the instructor went over the rest of the controls and gadgets, Red absorbed every detail like a sponge absorbs water. He wasn't going to forget anything. It was all too important. It was now a matter of life and death, his life and his death. The only death Red really wanted to contemplate was that funny little man with that ridiculous mustache and those bastards that flew for him. This instrument control class took no longer than an hour or so. Once the lesson was complete, he was dismissed. It was off to the officers' mess to have some dinner, a beer, and to share his thoughts with the rest of his buddies. Day 3 at OTU, and Red was ready for the advanced training to continue. As soon as breakfast was complete, he was approached by an OTU flight commander. Red recognized him right away and stiffened up with a salute until he was given the "as you were" command. Then the commander asked Red what he had learned so far. Red explained all about the cockpit controls, and before he can get into any further details, the commander asked Red to walk with him over to a Hurricane sitting near a tree, and had Red show him all that he had learned. After a minute or two, the commander said, "Right, go get your parachute." Red did as he was told, and upon his return started running towards the Miles Master. The commander barked at him to forget that tiny Miles Master and to jump into the Hurricane. He wanted to see Red take it up for a quick flight. "We have 45 minutes to spare, so go up solo and get a feel for her," he was instructed. Young Red obeyed with pleasure. As this young 19-year-old kid went down his checklist and prepared for takeoff, all he could think to himself was, "What am I doing here?" He was more scared now than at any other time. He was intimidated by the raw power he felt under his seat as he throttled up the RPMs. The next thing he knew, the wheels were leaving the ground. He was airborne in one of the most sophisticated killing machines of the time, and he was in total control. By the time he got his landing gear up and prop trim, there was nothing below him but water. Oh my gosh, he thought. Seemed like he was halfway to France. It took him a little time to get it turned around and heading back towards England. Once he was on the right heading, it took him a while to find the airfield. There was nothing below him now other than grassy fields with the occasional cottage. Where was that airstrip, he wondered. Then all of a sudden up ahead he saw his target getting closer. As he turned to base, then turned to final, he gauged his approach. He made a perfect landing. Once his Hurricane came to a complete stop and the engine was shut down, the ground crew started running towards him. Red so desperately wanted to jump out and do a happy dance while singing out loud and hugging everyone. But instead he acknowledged his ground crew by returning their salute and continued on as if it was just another perfect day in paradise. The OTU training lasted 5 weeks. It was a great time. There wasn't a whole lot of time to reflect on things like mom or dad or even his siblings or friends at Madsen. Gladys did pop into his head every now and then, and he was glad for it. She was his grounding with reality when his thoughts would carry him away. After all, he was still the same kid who loved to sit upon that grassy knoll and dream about flying, a dream he was now living. The clouds were now his best friends. He would dance with them daily, and he loved the dance with a passion. One of the strangest things for this kid from California to get used to was his commission. He and his mates would be walking down the street heading for a pub, and all of a sudden an enlisted man approaching would stand to the side and stiffen up while saluting. At first Red looked around to see who the soldier was focused on. Red didn't want to get in trouble for not saluting a senior officer. Then it hit him as he passed the young soldier. This guy was actually looking Red right in the eye. It was Red that was being respected. It was his uniform that gave him the authority. "Why are you saluting me?" he so desperately wanted to ask. "Don't worry, if no one's looking, just say, 'How you doing?'" he would have loved to have secretly offered. But he knew his place and the place of all those above him and those beneath him. A quick acknowledgement with a snap of the salute back, and everyone continued on their own way. He actually got to liking this, even though it never felt normal. It was also foreign to him, but he adapted. Like all of the lessons he was now exposed to, this was just another class, another lesson which was a part of the bigger picture. Red would sometimes wonder what his dad would think if only he could see him now. After all, his dad knew about ranks and commissions and protocols that went with them. As the training continued for the remainder of the 5 weeks, they covered as much as they possibly could. There was formation flying, instrument cloud training, and some gunnery and dogfighting with camera guns. These training flights would consume most of the day. It was no surprise, just like everything else in the RAF, the weather meant nothing. Rain or shine, the training continued. After 5 weeks were over at OTU, Red had gained 84 additional flying hours in Hurricanes. Once the training was completed, Red found himself posted to 234 Squadron in Port Reitz in Cornwall on the southwest tip of the UK. This is where he was given the opportunity to fly Spitfires at night. This was a new and very dangerous experience. There was a great number of flying accidents attributed to many factors, including experience
or the lack thereof, as well as weather and airfield locations. This field was located on a high bluff overlooking the ocean. Judging the approach was extremely challenging, a challenge that Red not only faced with caution, but conquered due to his experience and gut instinct. All of this was achieved by a 19-year-old American. The Brits were impressed. Red seldom paid for a beer. "It's on me, lad," was the norm. After about 2 weeks of intensive training at Cornwall, Red found himself posted to the 121 Eagle Squadron. This was a new squadron being formed at Curtin-Lindsey near Lincoln and would become the main fighter base for defense of the large port city of Hull on England's east coast. Now Red's dream was a reality, no longer just a dream, evolving into a reality. It had blossomed into the then and now. It was real. It was awesome. It was scary. Young Red arrived at the 121 Eagle Squadron during the last week of May 1941. How ironic, he thought, his passion, which grew upon that field of dreams, was to touch the clouds and never to let go. He dreamed about being able to soar where eagles fly. Red was now an eagle. He had his wings. He was soaring. What amazed Red was that in such a short time he went from flying his first solo in a Piper Cub to gaining experience with Hurricanes and Spitfires. He really enjoyed the Hurricane best of all. The Hurricane had better over-the-nose visibility when compared to the Spitfire. The Spit's glide angle was much faster and the nose was always in the way. The Hurricane also had a wider and more rugged landing gear, which proved to be an asset when landings were forced upon primitive landing strips. The Spitfire's landing gear would never have survived that sort of abuse. The Spit was at least 25 miles per hour faster and had better high-altitude performance. The Hurricane later models was much slower as they were fitted with 4 20mm cannons and external bomb racks. That, along with large radiators and air cleaners, made the Hurricane a top performer in hot and dusty regions of the world, where their presence was in high demand. If you're going to get shot at, the Hurricane proved to be the one plane that would most likely get you home, along with a prayer and some skill. The Hurricane was a lifesaver. Young Red became one with his Hurricane. The early Spitfires could not turn as tightly as the Hurricanes, but after some modifications in design, the Spit would outturn most aircraft of the era. Either the Spitfire or Hurricane in the hands of a competent pilot was an awesome fighting machine. The main drawback of both designs were their short-range limitations, especially when long-range missions were required. But both were excellent in doing what they were designed to do: defend Britain. The Germans had the same issues with short-range aircraft, which was a decisive factor during the Battle of Britain, as they couldn't provide adequate bomber escorts during missions over the UK. Red's new job was to protect Hull from these bomber missions, along with doing some escort flights. This was his moment. This was his time. It was time for Nazis to die. Let's go get the bad guys. Chapter 5. The European Theater. When young Red received his orders to head over to Curtin-Lindsey and report for duty with the Eagle 121 Squadron, he was pleased to notice that his report date was 7 days away. This meant he had a full week of leave in the entire United Kingdom to explore. He decided on a destination and boarded the next train north. He was heading for Scotland, the land of his ancestors, and the land of great Scotch, or so he had heard. After a full day of riding the rails, his train pulled into its final stop, Edinburgh. "Watch out, Scotland, young Red Campbell has arrived." It was time for him to leave his mark. It was time to party, Scottish style. Being springtime in Scotland, Red pondered, can life get any better? First order of business was to find a nice hotel located somewhere within easy walking distance to all the action. Within 30 minutes of his arrival, he found himself walking the Royal Mile looking for his hotel of opportunity. He found one right away. He inquired, "How much for a room?" "Only £1," he was told, and that seemed reasonable. "Done. Sign me up," he demanded, thinking he had found the best deal in town.
After throwing his bag on the bed and scoping out his newly acquired digs, he headed downstairs to get a shot or two of the one thing Scotland was famous for: single malt Scotch. Looking around the lobby for a few minutes and not finding the bar, he asked the desk clerk to please show him where it was located. "Oh, we sincerely apologize, sir," was the instant reply. "We don't serve alcohol on these premises. This is a temperance hotel," was explained in a very proper and formal manner. Red had accidentally checked himself into the one hotel that would do all they could do to thwart his plans for a week's worth of drinking and dancing, and doing all the other things he so longed for. There was plenty of pubs in the neighborhood, so it didn't take Red very long to find that infamous Scotch whiskey with a black and tan chaser. There were plenty of pubs in the neighborhood, so it didn't take Red very long to find that infamous Scotch whiskey with a black and tan chaser. While he went to bed that night, he laughed at his situation. You would think there would be a big sign out front that read, "Sorry, no booze sold here." First order of business tomorrow would be to find another place to stay. One of Red's high school teachers also went by the name Campbell. He used to share with the kids all of the glorious stories about his family and heritage. He would always say, "If you ever found your way to Scotland, look up my family. Look up the Campbells and they'll treat you right." Red had their name and number, and on the morning of day 2 in Scotland, he was knocking on their door. The Campbell clan was very impressed with this young American who knew their son. Red also got extra points for being a fighter pilot with the RAF, putting his life on the line for the common cause of defeating Germany. The biggest point maker of all was his being a Campbell. They treated him just like their own son. He was now officially part of their family and would remain so forever. Red didn't have to worry about lodging anymore. He was staying with the Campbells. He was sleeping in their bed and eating their food, and best of all, he was drinking their Scotch. Red finished the last couple of days of his leave in London, where the nightlife was electrical. The daytime was for resting, and the nights were his for the taking. In the middle of London there was a facility called the Overseas League, where any service person can find a room for next to nothing. His rate would only be 3 and 6 per night, which translated roughly to about $1. The beds were comfortable, the food was tasty, and the people were warm and loving. Dancing with pretty women and drinking tall mugs of warm beer would keep this young man occupied for the next couple of days. London had a lot to offer, especially to someone who happened to be serving in the RAF or in any other Commonwealth service. There were uniforms everywhere. Red would get used to the constant positive attention he and his dress blues would draw from the crowds around him. The occasional air raid was inconvenient, but he became more like the locals and simply ignored the sirens, unless his gut instinct told him otherwise. Then, like all good things, his leave came to an end. No more staying up late at night drinking free shots. No more dancing until dawn. It was time to sober up and become a fighter pilot again. It was time to refocus on the Eagle. He had plenty of time to refocus on his way to Curtin Lindsey. "Reporting for duty, sir," he snapped as he saluted. The Eagle had arrived at 121. Very interesting setup, Red thought as he surveyed the base and how the various squadrons were positioned. Rectangular shape, the airfield looked like an accident waiting to happen. In the upper left corner was the operations or command center. Then nestled in the lower right corner was the British Spitfire Squadron 65. In the upper right corner they positioned the Australian Spitfire Squadron 452, and in the lower left corner was Red's new home, the American Eagle 121 Squadron, along with their Hurricanes. The emergency scramble takeoff heading, regardless of the wind direction, was always diagonal towards the opposite corner of the base. So when the British were taking off, they were actually heading straight for the command center. When the 121 lads were taking off on a scramble, their heading was directly over the Aussies, giving Red one of his twisted little pleasures in life. He would hold the plane back a little, keeping it slightly lower than normal, causing his prop wash and engine decibels to abuse all of the Aussies in their bunks. What fun! Non-urgent flights were handled in a much more orderly fashion, while taxiing, lining up, and waiting your turn. The same went for landing. These flights used a common airstrip which ran right down the middle of the base. There were a number of occasions when a Hurricane from 121 was taking off at the same time as an Aussie Spit, just barely missing a mid-air collision. The airspace overhead was limited, extremely limited. Other than the usual kidding around, the Brits, Aussies, and Yanks all got along very well. After all, they were all in this thing together. There was no place for personality issues to surface, even though there were plenty of miserable personalities to deal with. Anger and irritation were better served when focused on the enemy. This was a family, and like Red's family back home, not everyone was perfect. The one thing Red really liked about the Aussies was their general outlook on everything. These guys were cowboys, plain and simple. They approached their meals, their comrades, their ground crew, and even their missions with a Yahoo attitude. They weren't as polished as the Brits, and this made them much better company when it came time for hanging up your hat and letting the stresses of the day seep away through a pint or two. They even found Red's low takeoffs amusing. They got the joke. The ladies, on the other hand, on the Aussie side of the base, didn't see the humor in it. Maybe the lasses need to kick back and let their hair down. Indian Jim Moore was to be Red's first roommate. Now here was a character the Brits had trouble understanding. Indian Jim was a Native American Indian who was waiting for his transfer papers back to the USA. The Brits were happily expediting the process. They wouldn't miss Jim in the least. It seems that standing on the corner in town, shuffling a handful of half-crowns from one hand to the other while whistling at the ladies wasn't behavior becoming of an officer. It just wasn't proper. The British senior officers found it embarrassing to the point of not asking him to stay in Curtin Lindsay, let alone England. Jim was not a social type. He avoided the base whenever he could. Sure, we were at war and pilots were in high demand. This allowed certain things to be overlooked, like personality flaws and maybe even taking off a little too low in order to buzz your comrades. Indian Jim usually pushed his boundaries well beyond the breaking point. Once, on a clear day, Jim was actually coming in for a normal landing and accidentally landed on a decoy field. The decoy fields were there to fool the Germans, not the RAF pilots. Well, Jim wiped out the field and his Hurricane. It was a long walk back to the base for Jim. This was the straw that broke the camel's back. It was time for Indian Jim Moore to leave. During his limited time left at Curtin Lindsay, Jim would never be in his room or in the mess hall. He always had somewhere else to be, somewhere that didn't include hanging out with anyone from the base. When Indian Jim received his paper sending him home, Red calculated he may have spent only 30 minutes in total visiting with Jim. Indian Jim Moore was one for the books. A new roommate was assigned to Red's quarters. Red enjoyed having someone to chat with after a busy day in the clouds. Earl Tootie Mason, an RCAF sergeant pilot, was now occupying the other bunk in Red's room. Half of the guys in 121 were Royal Canadian Air Force, and most of them were sergeant pilots. Usually after flying with a squadron for 2 months, sergeant pilots were offered commissions. Red found it interesting that a lot of these chaps would turn down a commission. A sergeant pilot actually received higher pay compared to a pilot officer. Red enjoyed the non-com pilots' company very much. They would invite Red to their mess, which was separate from the officers' mess. They had better beer, and it was cheaper. This was Red's recipe for a successful and long-lasting friendship. Once a flying officer like Red proved himself, they would be assigned their own aircraft. This would be their equipment and theirs alone, to be used during missions, unless it was in for service or repair. Red was issued his bird. This was a proud day for this still young 19-year-old American kid who so far survived everything that they had thrown his way. First order of business was to personalize his machine. Red's letters were AVC. The AV was for the British Eagle 121 Squadron, and the C equaled the manufacturer's number Z3399. Red preferred to think of the C as C for Campbell, and boldly had the letters AMPBELL painted on next to the C. There was a little dancing horse in the Disney movie Fantasia. Red adopted this little dancing horse as his logo and promptly had it painted just beneath the cockpit canopy on the right side of the plane, on top of the escape panel. This dancing horse reminded him of his dancing with the clouds, a dance he so very much loved. The main purpose for 121 Squadron in Curtin-Lindsey was to fly escort missions for convoys and to provide air defense for the port city of Hull. The main threat to convoys and Hull were German bombers. The Junkers 88s or Hinkel 111s were deadly twin-engine machines. They were able to slap England with ruthless punishment, and it was Red's job to slap them back even harder. These missions would keep him busy most of the time. When things were quiet, Red would be busy flying training missions. His hours in the air were adding up quickly. Out of the 100 or so convoy escorts Red flew, he might have seen action where he actually engaged the enemy 10 times. When it was time to get into the thick of it, adrenaline would take over. Your senses would go into autopilot, and your gut instinct would become your best friend and guardian angel. Red came to depend on his instincts regularly. When the public address or PA system went off, giving the signal to get airborne, these pilots had 2 minutes to be wheels off the ground or there'd be hell to pay. The pilot, along with his crew, would be standing by in readiness status. This means he and his ground crew were ready on a moment's notice. They practiced the procedure over and over and over again. No room for errors. The ground crew consisted of a fitter and a rigger. The fitter was responsible for the engine, and the rigger took care of the airframe. When the pilot was in readiness mode, his ground crew was on alert as well. Teamwork. The ground crew spent their day doing some minor maintenance if needed, or if things were quiet, they could be found lying under their Hurricane's wings, in the shade, waiting for the alarm to sound. Once the PA went off, the fitter climbed into the cockpit and started the engine. Once the engine was running, the rigger would disconnect the battery trolley and wheel it out of the way. By the time the pilot reached his aircraft, he would grab his parachute, which was waiting for him on the edge of the wing, and slip it on while he climbed into the cockpit. At the same time, the fitter would be climbing out of the cockpit onto the other side, positioning himself so he can help the pilot ease into the seat. The helmet was usually kept on top of the reflector gun sight. While the pilot was donning his helmet, the fitter would be putting the 3-point harness locking pin into place. As the canopy closed, the rigger would pull the chocks out from under the wheels. Up went the RPMs. With a quick glance to the left and right to ensure all is clear, the pilot would throw a salute towards his ground crew, confirming that all was ready. With that, the pilot would increase his speed until wheels were up and locked into place. This all took less than 2 minutes and required practice, practice, practice. If you took longer than 2 minutes, you had to answer for it when you returned. Red never had to have that conversation with the squadron leader. He and his crew were lightning quick. On a beautiful sunny day, while Red was in readiness and playing cards with his friends, the PA system went off. Red section scramble, red section scramble was blasted along with a compass heading. This was what he was waiting for. This was the result of the hours upon hours of training.
He was at his peak and he was ready to go do the job. This was going to be Red's first encounter with the enemy. As he approached his bird, he saw that all was well, engine running, trolley out of the way, and the fitter was climbing out of the cockpit. The rigger was standing by, ready to pull the chocks free. Red Howard had his parachute on and snapped into place in less than 10 seconds, and before he knew it, he was easing himself down into the cockpit with his fitter holding on to his shoulder straps, guiding him into place. With helmet on and canopy closed, the rigger pulled the chocks and tossed them out of the way. With a quick look around to ensure all was clear, he acknowledged his ground crew with a salute. Throttling up, he started inching forward. He was now rolling faster and faster towards the Aussies' corner of the airbase. No time for games now. He'll buzz them next time. All in all, it took him 1 minute and 49 seconds. Not bad. Not bad at all. Once he was off the ground, Red called the base to let them know he was airborne. This was when they would give him a specific heading if they had one. The tower replied back with the code word Angels, which was for an altitude adjustment, whether it be plus or minus. If they replied back with an actual altitude, that would mean they knew exactly where the bandit was. Red received this heading and immediately entered the clouds, fast and furious. Within a few moments he broke through the top of the cloud ceiling, only to find himself in a clearing between two cloud layers, maybe 2,000 feet in height. Right there above him, as he popped through the clouds, he saw them. The German Junkers 88 was cruising around looking for trouble. These were the bastards he longed to hunt. These were Hitler's gangsters, and Red was the law. Let's dance. The Junkers 88 was a mean killing machine, and Red had to face them alone. He can actually see the tracers streaming from their gun turret in his direction. This was a 15mm cannon shooting at him, but he didn't care. He was on them and maneuvered his Hurricane, getting ready for the kill. The German pilot was quick. Once he saw Red approaching, he simply disappeared into the clouds. Red yelled out, "Tally-ho!" as he turned on his reflector, took his gun off of safety mode, and began the hunt. The two of them danced the game of cat and mouse in and out of the clouds, each trying to anticipate what the other's next move would be. Red was armed. He was dangerous. The eagle was soaring, hunting for its prey. With the daytime sky glowing with tracers, both Red and the German gunner were trying to lock each other into their sights. Rounds were flying in every direction. Then, as if God was telling young Red that it was time to go home, the Hurricane's engine started acting funny. It just didn't sound right. It was Red's gut instinct that told him to give up for now. There will be another day to show the German menace what's what. Red listened to that inner voice and turned back towards his base, staying in the clouds to avoid being hit from behind. The engine was violently vibrating. It wasn't cooperating. He was now flying a high-powered glider and would only have one shot at landing. He called in for an emergency homing, which he received immediately. He was descending at a rate of over 300 feet per minute. He wasn't sure he could make it. Whatever was below him, once he broke through the clouds, would have to serve as a landing strip, whether it was a road, a field, or even a cottage. His options were limited. As the Hurricane cleared the clouds, Red was amazed at what he saw right there below him. It was his base, and he was perfectly lined up for the landing. How easy was that, he thought to himself as he immediately started lowering the wheels. It was literally less than 3 seconds from the time he heard the click indicating his wheels were down and locked to the moment that he touched the ground. He taxied up to the very spot he was on when he first took off and greeted his ground crew. After his ground crew assessed the Hurricane to see what happened, they let Red know just how lucky he was. He had taken a hit from the German 15mm cannon directly into the plane's induction system, which destroyed his supercharger. In no time at all, the bird was repaired, and ready for more action. Not long after his first dogfight, Red found himself on another emergency mission. There was a ship down there being harassed by a couple of twin-engine bombers. With Reed Tilley as his wingman, Red was off to save the day. Once they arrived at the scene, Red immediately selected his target and told Reed to go after the other guy. Tilley acknowledged and peeled off in chase. As Red dove, he can actually see, plain as day, the tail gunner tracking him. He also noticed the plumes of water splashing up as the bomber's payload hit the water surrounding the ship. He was scared for Tilley, thinking he had sent him off against the bad guys alone. Then something caught his attention. That bomber doesn't look German. It actually looks a lot like a Lockheed Hudson, a design Red was very familiar with. He called into the base to ask for instructions. "These bombers were ours," he shouted. He was instructed to use his own judgment. Red wasn't sure why our bombers would be bombing one of our own ships. Just then the bombers turned towards the English shoreline, and Red followed them in all the way to the Spittlegate base, not too far from Red's own base at Curtin Lindsey. A somewhat confused Red landed just behind the bombers and was about to give them a piece of his mind. "Do you realize how close you came to being shot down?" But before he could say a word, the crew from the bombers came up to him and thanked him for the practice. They told him that their gunners had a lot of fun tracking his Hurricane. Apparently they were practicing with dummy bombs on an old freighter that was grounded on a shallow reef. "Where's Reed?" he thought. Reed told him later that he had engine trouble and had to return to base. That didn't impress Red to know that Reed was leaving him to face the battle alone. Red wondered if Reed actually had engine trouble or simply wanted to avoid the solo confrontation with the enemy. Occasionally the Army would be doing maneuvers and would request the RAF to fly overhead, giving the troops on the ground a feel for being harassed by the German Luftwaffe. Red enjoyed these missions for many reasons, but mainly because he knew he wasn't going to be shot at. It was actually a lot of fun. As the Eagles approached their position, the Army would pull their trucks up against haystacks and lightly dust the tops of their vehicles with hay to provide some improvisational camouflage. Red could spot them a mile away, so he would pass over the haystacks in his Hurricane, fast and low. As he passed over, the wash from the propellers would cause the entire haystack to blow over, directly on top of the troops. It was during one of these Army practice missions that Red's roommate, Earl Tootie Mason, was killed. Pilot error. Earl was doing one of these low flybys and decided to do an inverted roll. While he was flying on his back, he saw some trees up ahead. His instinct was to pull the stick back in order to clear the trees. Wrong move. Earl didn't have that gut instinct Red came to depend on. He simply lost control. His plane got the best of him. Earl Tootie Mason crashed right then and there, upside down, where the meadow turns into forest. Dead. By now, Red had stopped counting his dead friends. After Earl's death, the squadron leader, Peter Powell, made an announcement to all of the pilots. They had lost more aircraft and pilots to low-flying accidents than to the enemy. They couldn't afford any more losses due to foolish games and tricks. He also made it very clear if any pilot tried a stupid stunt and actually survived, he would kill them himself upon their return to base. Any questions? There were none. Red received a new roommate almost immediately. His name was John I. Brown. He went by the nickname Brownie. They would be roommates for the rest of Red's time with 121 Squadron. Brownie was memorable for one thing, and one thing only: his German Shepherd. This was a beautiful dog, but dumb as a doorknob. It was impossible to house-train this mutt no matter how hard they tried. Red would be greeted every day by mounds of stinky dog crap. These were huge, stinky landmines just waiting there to be stepped on. Red would leave the door open to their room, wishing the dog would just wander off, but that dog was just too stupid to escape. Maybe that mutt knew he had a good thing going and just refused to leave. Germany invaded Russia. This was a tactical blunder on Hitler's part. He now has two fronts to deal with and not enough manpower or machinery to support his needs. The German war machine was in full swing by now, but Hitler's goals would soon prove to be too costly for Germany to support. The Luftwaffe and their resources were now divided, with the more urgent need being in Russia and the Eastern Front. This meant less combat missions for the RAF. Work for the fighter pilots in England dropped off. This was a good thing. More time for the Eagles to fly during British Army maneuvers. Less shooting, less getting shot at. This was around the same time that the North African and the Middle East theaters were heating up. It seemed like the war was spreading like a cancer globally. The British weather was taking its toll on young Red. Not only was he dealing with the boredom of babysitting the army, he was also dealing with the constant head cold. There was that burning desire again, deep down inside, pushing him to seek out more adventure. England wasn't feeding that deep down fire anymore, and that just wouldn't do. This was when Red submitted his request to volunteer for the North African theater. Red wanted to chase Rommel, the desert fox. Between North Africa and the Middle East, he was sure there would be plenty of work to keep him busy. More bad guys to hunt. Squadron leader Powell pulled Red aside and asked him to withdraw his request. 121 Squadron needed Red and couldn't afford to lose him. Pilots were being lost daily, and they were hard to replace. 71 Eagle Squadron recently lost 4 planes and their pilots in just one day. Devastating numbers for 71. They were now borrowing pilots from 121 Squadron. Red understood. He was a team player. He didn't want to leave 121 anymore. He withdrew his request. For now. It was now the beginning of October 1941, and Red had reached the status of Deputy Flight Commander. He got to decide who flew on which missions. He took on this responsibility with great compassion and professionalism. All of this upon the shoulders of a Yank not even 20 years of age. Then one morning an event was going to arise that would change this young man's destiny once and for all. It was going to be a chain reaction that would start from a simple phone call. Once Red picked up that phone, there'd be no turning back. His personality, along with his pride and his desire for adventure, was going to open up new doors. Be careful of what you ask for. You might just get what you want. As young Red picked up the phone and gave his normal official greeting, he received a request for gun cooperation. This was another one of those pretend the Hurricane is a German attacking our post missions. This was another one of those missions where Red got to knock over haystacks onto unsuspecting army personnel. And yes, if they were quick, they too could maybe get a fix on Red's aircraft and practice tracking him in their sights. Red asked the voice on the other side of the phone, "How low do you want us to go?" The reply he heard was, "The lower the better." Red would take this job himself. After all, no one was better qualified to fly fast and low. After updating Powell on what he was doing and detailing that they had asked for fast and low, Powell simply said, "Remember my rules. If you break them, I'll kill you myself." "Yes, sir," Red replied as he eagerly left the office. His ground crew got the Hurricane ready for his mission, while Red double-checked his gear. Wheels were up and locked within minutes. During one of the fast and low flybys, Red noticed this vehicle driving to the side of the road. He brought his Hurricane within 25 yards of this car and laughed as he watched it drive off the road right into the weeds. Now that was funny, he laughed to himself, while watching soldiers scramble in all directions. Mission accomplished. Back at base, Red's crew told him to report to the commander's center ASAP. "What's going on?" he inquired. He could see Powell was waiting for him with a not-so-happy look on his face. Red was severely raked over the coals. He was also informed that the car he ran off the road had the station commander inside it. At that point, Red realized that maybe he just went a little bit too far. But it was still pretty funny when he thought back at the images of those soldiers running in the mud trying to escape the prop wash. "Oh yeah, two more things I want to tell you, Campbell," Powell shouted with anger. "First, the station commander wants to see you right after lunch. Second, I've reconsidered your request to transfer to North Africa." With that said, young Red's time with Eagle 121 Squadron came to a glorious end. Red was to make his way up to Duxford near Cambridge to join up with the New Zealand 258 Squadron. This is where he would get prepared for his eventual departure to North Africa. But first, 2 weeks of leave would be in order. Time to relax, drink, and recover from the multitude of inoculation shots he would have to endure. The Eagle was preparing to once again leave the nest. Chapter 6. The African Theater. When your new posting is somewhere within the UK, you receive 1 week of leave. When you're being posted overseas, they would give you 2 weeks of R&R before sending you off to face the enemy. Red was more than happy to party in London for 14 days. He had already experienced all of the wonders of Scotland, so it would be the sights and sounds of the Marble Arch, Piccadilly Circus, and all of the other wonderful things London had to offer that grabbed his desires. The agenda for the next 2 weeks would be girls, booze, more girls, and maybe a little sleep in between. Once he was checked in at the Overseas League, young Red headed downstairs to the pub, pulled up a stool at the bar, and savoured his first mug of warm suds. This was to be the first of many. As he sat there, the bartender approached him and asked, "Hey, since you're a Yank, maybe you could tell me what this is used for?" Red looked over the bar and saw a case of Coca-Cola sitting on the floor. The bartender wasn't sure how to use cola, and was hoping young Red would share the famous American recipe. "Sure, you could sell it as is, on ice, but there'd be little profit, so why bother?" The bartender was baffled. "What kind of rum do you have?" Red inquired. A bottle of Jamaica's finest was placed on the bar immediately. Then Red asked, "Great. Now do you have any limes?" The bartender placed a couple next to the bottle of rum. The bartender watched as Red mixed the Coke with the rum into 2 glasses of ice, followed by adding fresh lime juice. Red slid one of the glasses towards his new friend, then picked up his own glass and said, "This is a Cuba Libre, the Mexican version of rum and Coke." With a hearty cheers, they both sampled the cool, refreshing cocktail. Perfectly blended, Red thought. The bartender was impressed too, and for the rest of that night, Red drank Cuba Libres on the house. Quite proud of himself, Red continued to sip away at his cocktail while making interesting conversation with the bartender. Red found the barkeep and his stories rather interesting. Young Red also enjoyed sharing his own adventures. The bartender eagerly absorbed Red's tales while serving all of the other patrons who wanted to quench their own thirsts. Before he knew it, Red's 4th drink was slipping down nice and easy. It was immediately replaced with another. He didn't even have to ask. His glass was bottomless, and Red was impressed at how well he was holding his own. Not like the other chaps in the pub who were staggering around like fools. Red was feeling pretty good, and to him that was the perfect way to start a 14-day leave from the stresses of squadron routines. Looking around, he noticed a couple of friends of his sitting at a table nearby. Red wanted to go over and invite them to his spot at the bar where endless drinks flowed for free. Sitting there not 15 feet away was Leroy Skinner and Jim Daly, both from 121 Squadron. These were good guys, friends, and comrades worthy of a drink or two on the house. As Red stood up and headed towards their table, something changed. He wasn't feeling so normal after all. The 5th rum and Coke had taken its toll on this young flyer's equilibrium, and it wasn't letting go. Red took no more than 2 or 3 steps before he lost total control of his legs.
The next thing he knew, he was free-falling right on top of the table where his mates were sitting. That was it for his sober night. That was it for his rum and cokes. That was it for the table, which now lay upon the floor, along with Red, splintered into several non-repairable pieces. Knowing Red needed some help, Leroy and Jim picked up the staggering, mumbling, drooling remains of their friend and took him upstairs to their room to help him get sobered up. After some food and coffee and a good head dunking or two, Red was feeling better. Still drunk, but at least he knew where he was, and the spins were gone. Looking around the room, he realized that he wasn't alone with Leroy and Jim. There were 2 girls in the room with them. Red was now in the mood to dance, and not with Leroy or Jim. Just then there was a knock at the door, and when Jim returned from answering it, he asked Red if he could help them out of a jam. It seemed someone snitched to the hotel staff that there were ladies in the room. This was not permitted, and if caught, could lead to being expelled from the hotel permanently. At 3 and 6 per night, it was too good of a deal to throw away. "How can I help?" Red inquired. "Easy," Jim replied. "Let's stash the girls in your room for now, just in case management decides to do a spot inspection." "Fine with me," Red slurred. "What's mine is yours," he offered openly. The lasses were escorted to Red's room upstairs and told to quietly wait. Back at Jim and Leroy's room, the trio sat at a table, pretending they were playing cards. Suddenly, there was the expected knock at the door. "Who is it?" Jim yelled. "This is the manager. Please open the door. We know you have ladies in there. You will have to leave these premises," the voice demanded from the other side of the door. "Just a minute," Jim teased as he slowly walked to the door. Taking his time, he removed the door's latch and welcomed the management lynch mob in. There were 3 of them standing there eagerly waiting to bust these RAF pilots. "Girls? What girls?" Leroy teased while still arranging the cards in his hand. Red smiled. What fun, he thought while playing along. Jim invited them in to take a look around. After all, there was nothing to hide, at least in this room. With a quick look to and fro, no lasses were found by the management team. "Sorry, sir, we must have received some bad information. You gentlemen have a splendid evening," the manager apologized as he and his crew backed out of the room, closing the door behind them. When the 3 guilty pilots returned to Red's quarters to get the ladies, they found an empty room. The ladies had flown the coop. "Oh well," they laughed, "it's a pretty big pond out there. Let's go fishing." Nearby there was a crackers club in which Jim was a member. Because regular pubs or bars closed at respectable hours, the crackers club was the answer for those who wanted to continue with the party until the wee hours of the morning. All you had to do to be a member was to purchase a case of liquor and store it at the club. Then whenever the need for a late-night nightcap arose, you would go to the club and drink from your own private stash. In reality, you can order a drink of anything from any stash while enjoying a burlesque stage show. The program began with a stand-up comedian delivering not-so-funny jokes, followed by the cabaret girls in skimpy outfits dancing the can-can. This would end up being a short night at the Crackers Club for the boys. Apparently Jim didn't like the comedian and started heckling by yelling, "Bring back the girls!" over and over again. Then, to make things worse, Jim ran up to the stage and used the seltzer bottle to hose down the frustrated comedian. Well, the comedian was pretty funny now. The entire room broke into laughter. When the bouncers showed up, the 3 pilots agreed it was time to leave. It wasn't worth fighting these huge peacekeepers. They looked mean. The rest of Red's leave was spent in and out of pubs, dancing and trying to avoid trouble. Trouble had a way of always finding Red. 2 weeks of frolicking fun passed too quickly for young Red. He now found himself heading up to Duxford, the home of the New Zealand 258 Squadron. This would be Red's new family. This is where he would train for his mission. He would need to learn how to take off and land on aircraft carriers with little or no room for errors. They actually painted white lines on the runway to simulate the dimensions of a carrier. The rules were simple. If you touch the white line, your plane has gone over the imaginary side of the carrier and into the imaginary water. Red picked this up quickly and only needed 2 or 3 days before he had the carrier takeoff and landing thing mastered. Now he was ready for what lay before him. His adventure would take him from the cozy British landscape to the unforgiving terrain of North Africa and the Middle East. He was now ready to be briefed on his mission. Red was told that he was going to head over to Gibraltar, get on a carrier and set sail to the Mediterranean Sea. From there he would fly off of the carrier towards Malta, a flight that would take him across 700 miles of water. The long-range tanks attached to his Hurricane would allow Red to fly between 900 and 1,000 miles distance, if economical flying habits were observed. Once in Malta, he would refuel and immediately head for Alexandria in Egypt. In Egypt, he would refuel and head for Palestine, where he would refuel once again. From there, he would fly into northern Iran to join up with the Russian Air Force. Red wasn't very happy about the whole Russian Air Force thing, but he had a job to do and was up for the challenge. Red boarded the next train for Liverpool with his orders in hand, ready to embark on the next chapter of his adventure. All he knew was that he would soon find himself in Egypt, the land of ancient pharaohs, pyramids, and the mighty Nile River, places he had read about as a child and thought he would never get to see. Here he was now not only visiting these far-off exotic lands, but was flying there as an RAF pilot. Dreams can come true. Those who qualified for carrier duty joined Red on the journey. Once in Liverpool, they boarded a rather large British cargo ship named the Athena. The ship's hold was loaded with wingless Hurricanes along with crates of spare parts and, of course, the wings. Ironically, the Athena departed Liverpool on November 3, 1941, Red's 20th birthday. It seemed like a good reason to celebrate. After all, there was nothing better to do for the next 3.5 days at sea. They sailed around the northern tip of Ireland and straight south until they reached Gibraltar, one of the few remaining territories in the region still friendly to the British. The deck crew aboard the Athena weren't impressed with these RAF pilots. These mariners tried to flex their muscle whenever possible. If you weren't an officer of a certain rank or higher, you were restricted to lesser accommodations. The gunroom was where warrant officers and junior or sub-lieutenants were to confine their living space. The officers' area was for first lieutenants and higher. The sergeant pilots had to remain with the other non-coms in more crude surroundings. Because Red was a junior lieutenant, the deck crew tried to stow Red and the other commissioned RAF pilots in the gunroom. These cocky pilots told the crew to screw off and headed straight for the officers' quarters, searching for empty cabins that they can find. They found plenty. When the crew tried to file an official complaint with the ship's captain, they were promptly reminded that their vessel was under charter by the RAF, and they bloody better well stay out of the way of these flyers. Case closed. Since the non-coms, including the sergeant pilots and the angry deck crew, were given only one ration of rum per day, the commissioned pilots were more than happy to share their unlimited supply. This finally brought peace to all. Time passed quickly. They soon arrived in Gibraltar. Half of the pilots and their planes were offloaded from the Athena and transferred over to 2 carriers, the Ark Royal and the Argus. These were the pilots who would join up with the Russians, and Red wasn't one of them. Thank God. All of the 258 Squadron and half of the 232 Squadron remained in Gibraltar. Their destiny had yet to be disclosed. As soon as the Ark Royal was loaded up, she set sail for Malta, just 58 miles south of Sicily. After 1.5 days at sea, at first dawn, all 34 pilots took off from the deck of the Ark Royal for the island of Malta. Of the 34 pilots, 32 made it, 2 were lost. These numbers were within the acceptable range for casualties. On her way back to Gibraltar, the Ark Royal was hit by a German torpedo and severely damaged. Only one sailor was killed. Even though she could have made it back to Gibraltar, her starboard list was severe enough to warrant fear of her either capsizing in dry dock or maybe even sinking in the shipping lanes, causing a navigational hazard to other ships. It was decided to let her sink in peace On November 13th, 1941, the Ark Royal went down with dignity. Now there was only the British carrier in the region, the Argus. The Brits couldn't afford to lose her as well. Red now lived full-time on the Athena. He kept his Hurricane at the nearby airdrome. This is the airport where he and the others would fly out of during their missions. His sorties were primarily sub-hunting and coastal patrol. These missions were boring, but at least he got some cockpit time as a second pilot in a Catalina PBY twin-engine flying boat. He found it interesting that the PBYs he was flying were built in his hometown of San Diego. It's a small world after all. When it came time for a sub-hunting mission, they would use the PBY with depth charges mounted under her wings. The RAF volunteered to fly as second-in-command during these missions due to an increasing pilot shortage. Red got to log in some hours at the control of these clumsy flying boats. They would get towed out into deeper waters by boat. Then, before they were turned loose, the depth charges would be manually armed. While the PBYs were flying low around their patrol grid, if a sub was spotted, the depth charges would be released. Once they returned to base, a boat would meet them, disarm the remaining depth charges, and tow them back to shore. Red didn't realize until later on exactly how dangerous their missions were. If one of these planes sank with depth charges tethered to the wings, once the plane hit the predetermined depth, the depth charges would blow like the 4th of July. This actually happened to a plane that hit a partially sunken ship while landing and immediately began to sink. It didn't take long for her to thrust the seas upwards with a violent explosion. No survivors. Red's other missions involved shore patrol. They would take their Hurricanes up and down the Atlantic shoreline, searching for German planes, boats, or anything else Nazi. None were ever seen. The Germans flew in and out so quickly the odds of spotting one was almost zero. The presence of the RAF definitely made the Germans in the area more nervous. They didn't have the entire territory all to their own. The British were close by and getting closer. On one of these missions, Red and his wingman Don Gaffin were patrolling. There was nothing below them except for the sandy beaches of Cape Sertel in Morocco. All of a sudden, Don started experiencing some engine trouble. He wasn't sure he'd be able to make it back to base, so he decided to take advantage of the beach and do an emergency landing. Red stayed with him all the way. Don laid his bird down nice and slow, with wheels up, on the sandy beach, and slowly slid to a smooth and gentle stop. Red called the base to inform them of the crash landing, then called to Don to make sure he was okay. Don was just fine. "Don't forget to destroy your airplane," Red instructed. Don replied, "I can't. Don't have any matches." Don was a non-smoker and had no way of starting a fire. Last thing you wanted was to have your airplane taken over by the local militia. Red had Don run up the beach, ensuring he was out of harm's way. Once Don was safely out of distance, Red did 3 passes, each time hitting Don's plane with all he had. Still no flames. Lots of damage, but no fire. Finally, some of the RF boys who were dispatched to the crash site were able to put the beached Hurricane out of her misery. Red could see the local Tangiers militia heading for the beach. He watched as Don made his way to cover. Nothing more anyone could do, so it was back to the base, and maybe a prayer or two for Don. Red came to find out much later Don actually talked his way out of the sticky situation using his charm and wit. Don was captured by the militia and was being processed. There was a good chance he would have been handed over to the Germans. These locals played both sides of the war. Their loyalty depended on which side would offer them greater rewards. Don was destined to be a POW somewhere in Europe for the remainder of the war. Well, Don ended up charming the daughter of the Governor General of Tangiers and talked her into giving him food, keys to the cell, a gun, and transportation to the Egyptian border where he could eventually find his way back to the Allies. Maybe being captured would have been best for Don, as he ended up getting shot down and killed in the South Pacific a few months later. Don was another one for the books. Little did Red know at the time that his delay in Gibraltar was part of a much bigger plan being hatched by Churchill. The mission would involve the 258 lads as well as the remaining 232 and any other available support in the region. The Brits were planning on a major offensive landing in French Algiers. The date for the mission was to be sometime in December. During Red's entire tour in North Africa, he saw 0 enemy planes and 0 enemy submarines. He did get to see a lot of sand and sun and ate some very interesting food. But as far as action went, it was no more exciting than back in England, chasing British Army vehicles off of the road. On the bright side of things, at least he wasn't flying with the Russian Air Force. Red had just received his orders about the upcoming offensive in French Algiers. He was ready for some action. He was itching to see, chase, and kill the bad guys. It was early December 1941, and everything looked like a go. Then on the 7th, news came in that Pearl Harbor was attacked by the Japanese. There was extensive damage to the U.S. Naval Pacific Fleet. Japan had attacked Red's soil, killing over 2,400 Americans. They attacked Red's homeland. The USA was now officially in the war, whether they liked it or not. For young Red, this was just fine and dandy. London immediately cancelled the Algerian offensive. They had a new mission for the 258 and 232. Red had no idea what was going on. The 258 had packed up their equipment and loaded up the Athena. They immediately set sail for Takoradi near the Ivory Coast. From there, they offloaded, reassembled their Hurricanes, and flew to Khartoum in the Egyptian Sudan. A journey that would take them 4 or 5 days, refueling at various British outposts dotted along the way. From Sudan, they flew to Alexandria. Now things started getting a little more interesting. This is when they would sharpen their skills by hunting for and shooting at the desert fox. Rommel was nearby, and the RAF was going to help keep him at bay. If Rommel and his boys weren't anywhere to be found, the RAF lads would practice their aim by shooting at burnt-out vehicles and tanks. This was entertaining to young Red, who was itching for action. Problem was, their guns were giving them constant problem. You can't go into battle with equipment that doesn't work perfectly. Anything less than perfection could mean death. Most of the time in Alexandria was spent trying to sort out the gun problem, a daunting task which seemed never-ending. Fix one thing and something else would break down in its place. Then one day, without notice, the 258 Squadron received new orders. They were loaded up on an air transport, heading back to Khartoum. From there they boarded a train for the overnight trip to Port Sudan in Egypt. It seemed like the porters on the train weren't overly impressed with the RAF boys. They didn't think it was appropriate for Red and the gang to be shooting out of open windows at vultures sitting on fence posts. It seems the lads were ready to kill anything. Once in Egypt, they were issued new Hurricane 2Bs, which were fitted with 12 rapid-fire 303 machine guns, each capable of firing 1,100 rounds per minute. This was an awesome fire rate, even though the punch of the round was not as severe as the 20mm cannon. But overall, rapid fire seemed to cause a lot more damage as it ripped through its target. Even though you didn't hit as hard with the 303, you hit a lot faster, and that rapid repetition was what made the difference. But like all fine-tuned machines, they too had their jamming issues due to the environment. There was sand everywhere. You couldn't get away from it. Sure, there were special filters used on Hurricanes, but they also had limited air intake, reducing your performance. It was also common to find sand in your food, coffee, bed, hair, toothpaste, and any other place one could think of. A new plan was in place. Arrangements were being finalized immediately to expedite the deployment of New Zealand's 258 Squadron to the South Pacific. The war was now being fought on many fronts, but unlike the enemy, the good guys had the manpower. They had the resources, they had the resolve, and most of all, they were pissed. The world would never be the same. This ugly little man with that ugly little mustache had drawn all of humanity into chaos. If the Japs wanted a piece of it, Red was more than pleased to offer them up a serving, Campbell style. After their planes checked out and the final tweaking was done, they flew a few extra engine test flights just to make sure all was as it should be. Everything worked. Then, without notice, the entire group was loaded up onto a carrier, the HMS Indomitable. It didn't take long to get her underway. There was a sense of urgency in the air that went without saying. No words were necessary. Everyone was working towards the common goal as one well-oiled machine. No questions as to which mess you ate at or what you did during your off hours. Everyone was there to support the mission. They were on their way to the South Pacific. Sailing from the Middle East to the South Pacific was a long and tedious journey. The first stop would be at the Maldives Islands, a couple of 100 miles south of India, where the Arabic Sea meets the Indian Ocean. This will be the only opportunity for the carrier to refuel. From there, it was on to the final destination, within flying distance of the island of Java. This will be Red's new home. To date, he had traveled 3/4 of the way around the globe. He was in hot pursuit, and since the Germans proved to be non-challenging to him, he now focused his desires on those menacing Japs. Those who dared to slap the United States were about to face the wrath of Red. Red's heart ached. Red was angry. Red saw red. The Eagle was pissed. Chapter 7. The South Pacific Theater.